Hello everyone. In this class, we'll learn about language and speech. The learning objective of this class would be to name the speech areas in the brain, trace the pathway for speech, and understand the theory of speech production, classify speech and language disorder, and understand the physiological basis of these abnormalities. As they are the best ways of expressing oneself, speech and language functions are fundamental to human civilization. The ability to communicate by language, both in writing and speaking, is the special skill. Human beings are also capable of expressing their efficiency and emotion without using speech, like presenting oneself through the quality of work one does, that is the work language, or conveying the message through their physical changes, that is the body language, or through emotional feelings, the expressive language. Thus, language is not limited to expression only through the speech or writing. However, generally it can be stated that language is the means of communicating one's thought through spoken words or in writings. And is also the medium for all delicate interpersonal transactions. It is more complex to understand the physiology of language because of the intricate mechanisms in the brain that integrate this unique function. Most of our knowledge of language processing is based on the clinical data by analyzing patients with aphasias that develop following diseases affecting the cerebral cortex and cerebral damage due to brain injury or neurosurgery. Language and speech areas in the brain. There are four main areas in the brain that play important role in processing of language and speech. These four areas are collectively known language zone that are present around the syllabian fissure, therefore also called as perisyllabian area. Two are called receptive areas and two are called executive areas. All these areas are located in association cortex adjacent to the cortical areas that are essential in language formation. Which are the receptive areas? The receptive areas are also called as sensory speech areas as they receive and process the sensory information for speech. They are Wernicke's area, that is area number 22, that subserves the perception of spoken language, and angular gyrus, which is area 39, that subserves the perception of written language. The area 41 and 42 are also included in the receptive area that take part in processing spoken language. Wernicke's area. This is so named as it was described by Carl Wernicke in 1874. Wernicke's area is located in the upper part of the temporal lobe, the area that is in the parietal temporal occipital association cortex. This is the major association area for processing sensory information from the somatosensory, visual, and auditory cortices. Wernicke's area is essential for comprehension, recognition, and construction of the words and language. Patients with lesion in Wernicke's area may speak, but the words they frame and put together will have no meaning. Angular gyrus, that is area 39, this is the second receptive area that occupies the angular gyrus in the inferior parietal lobule anterior to the visual receptive area. This is also called as de Jorain's area, and this subserves the perception of written language. Ex- Expressive or executive areas. The executive areas are also called as motor speech areas as they execute the expression of speech. They are Broca's area, that is area number 44 and 45, and Exner's writing area. Broca's area is concerned with motor aspects of speech, and hence called motor speech area. This area was described by Paul Broca in 1864. It is present in the frontal lobe, which is located in the prefrontal association cortex adjacent to the motor cortex. Broca's area regulate functions of the muscles of the lips, tongue, pharynx, and larynx. Patients with lesion of Broca's area are capable of comprehending a spoken or written word, but they are not able to say the word. Exner's writing area is located in the posterior part of the frontal lobe, though some disagreement exists for this concept. The visually perceived words are given expression in writing through this area. Thus, there are two parallel systems for speech. One is for understanding the spoken words and producing speech, and other for understanding a written word and producing writing. Arcuate fasciculus. The sensory and motor areas are intricately connected with each other, especially a rich network of nerve fiber. The arcuate fasciculus, which passes through the isthmus of temporal lobe and posterior end of the synovian fissure, connects the Wernicke's area with Broca's area. This fasciculus coordinates the understanding and execution of speech and the language skills. Broca's area is further connected with the lower Rolandic cortex by short association fibers that in turn innervate the speech apparatus, that is, the muscles of mouth, tongue, and throat. So these are the different areas. I mean, as we discussed, Wernicke's, angular gyrus, degerens areas are the receptive areas, whereas Broca's external areas, they are the motor areas, and the arcuate fasciculus, which is going to form a bridge between these two areas. Theories of speech production. Angular gyrus receives visual and auditory inputs and makes preliminary processing of these information. Angular gyrus projects to Wernicke's area, which is concerned with the comprehension of visual and auditory information. Wernicke's area projects to Broca's area through arcuate fasciculus, which further processes information received from Wernicke's area into elaborate process of vocalization, that is, programming and articulation. Broca's areas projects to motor cortex that bring about the motor activities of speech apparatus, which finally produces speech. Language function is closely associated with the concept of cerebral dominance. It is highly lateralized function of the brain residing in the left hemisphere in the right-handed person. This dominance is observed also in left-handed individuals. So the disorders of speech and language. Speech and language disorders may be divided into four categories. It is aphasia or dysphasia, disturbance of speech of secondary to the global diseases, dysarthria and aphonias. Aphasia or dysphasia is a loss or impairment of production and comprehensions of the spoken or written language due to an acquired lesion in the brain, and it is called as aphasia. It can be because of the disturbance of speech secondary to the other global diseases, like disturbance of speech or language with the diseases that globally affect the higher mental functions, like dementia, in which speech and language functions are impaired as a part of general loss. For example, Alzheimer's disease, the gradual loss of all aspects of language function occurs without any specific aphasia. In this category, commonly palilalia, that is extreme perseveration, and echolalia, the patient repeats the words he hears like a parrot, are observed. Dysarthria is a defect in articulation of speech with intact mental function and comprehension of spoken and written language. This occurs purely due to the disorder of muscles of articulation, which may be due to the flaccid or spastic paralysis. Aphonia is a loss of voice due to the disorder of larynx or its innervation. There are different types of aphasia. Aphasias are broadly divided in four categories. There is motor aphasia, sensor aphasia, global aphasia, and dissociative language syndromes. Motor aphasia, which is also called as Broca's aphasia, this is called non-fluent aphasia or expressive aphasia. This occurs in disease processes that affects Broca's area. The primary deficit in the language output or speech production with the relative preservation of comprehension. In its mildest form, motor speech deficit manifests as a poverty of speech, that is cortical dysarthria, with preservation of comprehension and ability to write. In advanced form, there is a complete loss of power of speaking. There is no paralysis of speech apparatus, as patient can chew, swallow, clear the throat, cry, or even vocalize without word. Usually, lower part of the face and arm of the right side are weak. Sensory aphasia, or it is also called as Wernicke's aphasia, which is also called as fluent aphasia or receptive aphasia. This occurs in disease processes that affects Wernicke's areas. The syndrome comprises of two main features, that is impairment of comprehension of speech, and they are relatively fluent but paraphasic speech, that is use of malformed and inappropriate words. The impairment of comprehension is basically inability to differentiate the word elements or uh, phonemes, both spoken and written, which indicate the involvement of auditory and visual association areas. The defect in language is manifested by inability to repeat written or spoken word. Despite of fluency in speech, the language is remarkably devoid of speech. They also cannot understand of what is said to them. The motor apparatus required for expression of language remains intact. The written letters are often combined to meaningless words. Okay, so this is the pathway of speech uh, for naming the visual object. So this is where the angular gyrus, the primary visual cortex area, sends information to the angular gyrus. Okay, so then it sends information to the Wernicke's area. So then it is going to send the information to the Broca's area, which is going to uh, convert it into the motor act, which is going to send impulses to the facial areas for the articulation of the speech. Global aphasia occurs due to the destruction of large part of language zone, including both Broca's and Wernicke's area. The lesion usually occurs due to the occlusion of left internal carotid artery or middle cerebral artery. All aspects of speech and language are affected. At best, they may say few simple words, but characteristically they fail to carry out series of simple commands or name objects. They cannot read, write, or repeat what is said to them. Usually this syndrome is associated with varying degree of right hemiplegia, hemianesthesia, and homonymous hemianopia. Dissociative language syndromes. Dissociative language syndromes refer to language deficits that do not result from lesion of cortical language areas, but from disruption of pathways joining them. Included in this category are conduction aphasia, pure word deafness, pure word blindness, pure word mutism, anomic aphasia, and transcortical aphasia. Conduction aphasia occurs due to the separation of auditory and motor language areas without damaging these areas. Characteristically, repetition is severely affected for both single words and one words in the face of preserved comprehension. There is a fluency and paraphasia in self-initiated speech as seen in Wernicke's aphasia. Writing is invariably impaired. Pure word deafness, this is also called as auditory verbal agnosia, and is characterized by impairment of auditory comprehension and repetition and an inability to write following dictation. Spontaneous writing and ability to comprehend written languages are preserved that uh, differentiate it from Wernicke's aphasia. They may declare that they may not hear. Audiometry discloses no hearing defect. Usually the lesion is bilateral in superior temporal gyrus. Pure word blindness, this is also called as visual verbal agnosia, is characterized by inability to read loud, to understand written script, and to name colors. Therefore, it is also called as visual verbal or color anomia. Understanding spoken language, repetition of what is heard, writing spontaneously, and to dictation and conversation are all intact. The striking feature is that capacity to write fluently is retained, but he cannot read what has been written. So this is called as alexia without agraphia. Lesion usually affects the left visual cortex. The genitalo-calcarine tract and the connection of the visual cortex of the dominant hemisphere with the language areas. So lesion usually uh, affects the left visual cortex. It is because of the genitalo-calcarine tract and the connection of the visual cortex of the dominant hemisphere with the language areas. Pure word mutism, the loss of capacity to speak while perfectly retaining the ability to write, to understand the spoken word, to read silently with the comprehension, and to repeat spoken words is called as pure word mutism or euphemia. So this is also called pure motor aphasia of Dejerine. This occurs due to the vascular lesion or localized injury to the dominant frontal lobe. Anomic, uh, anomic aphasia, there is no difficulty with speech or understanding the auditory information, but there is difficulty in understanding written language or picture. This occurs due to the lesion of angular gyrus in categorical hemisphere without affecting the language areas. The visual information is not transmitted to Wernicke's area. Transcortical aphasia, there will be isolation of language areas due to the hypoxic injury as occurs in carbon monoxide poisoning or prolonged hypotension results in this particular syndrome. Either the motor area, motor speech area or the sensory speech area is isolated from the rest of the cortex in the same hemisphere. Accordingly, it results in transcortical motor aphasia, that is inability to initiate conversation speech with the preservation of comprehension and repetition. Or transcortical sensory aphasia, that is the deficit auditory and visual word, but speech remains fluent and repetition is remarkably preserved. Other language disorders are agraphias. Agraphia is the loss of previously processed ability to communicate through writing. Though writing is an integral component of language function, many people speak without learning to read or write. Therefore, if someone has already learned writing and then he loses this ability, agraphia is said to be present. Pure agraphia is very rare. There are different types of agraphias, that is aphasic agraphia, constructional agraphia, apraxic agraphia, and linguistic agraphia, that is disorders of articulation. The impairment of articulation is called as dysarthria. Articulation consists of contraction of pharynx, palate, tongue, lips that alter the vocal sounds. In pure dysarthria, there is no abnormality of cortical language mechanisms. They understand perfectly whatever is heard and have no difficulty in reading and writing. It is commonly due to the neuromuscular problems. Disorder of phonation, that is aphonia, it is impairment of phonation. It occurs due to the paralysis of the vocal cords. Paralysis of respiratory movements can also produce aphonia because insufficient air is provided for phonation. So this is regarding the speech and language and some of the applied aspect related to it. Thank you.